I talk too much, so that was supposed to be 2 minutes. My own time? We started 15 minutes early, so that was great. All right, do I get any news, Clint?
Sir, you can if you like.
Yeah. Clint Crozier, come on up. General Closer, he is, I'm going to do this introduction, and then I'll let him talk about his team. So one of the new things that we've got going is AFWIC, and this is exciting. It is a new way of doing business. The way we used to do it was the C-folds, all the core function leads would get together, and we would move millions of dollars of pucks around a board, and we would do it at the last minute. So all of us, when we were 1 stars and 2 stars, we would go in and we'd put together all these plans that we had on how we were going to move the Air Force forward, and that, you know, we're working in the future years, a defense plan, but 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future, 20 years in the future, under General Welsh. And we would put all these plans together, and then the final analysis, we'd have bills to pay, and we'd get all the 4 stars in, and they start moving pucks around. And we go, well, there goes all of that work that we did. And what it was, we were paying, you know, bills today, and just trying to get that work done, and we were forgetting about what had to go in the future. Or we weren't forgetting about it, but we were just getting mired in the things about how we were going to spend money today, and not about what we were going to do in the future. One of our great strategic thinkers said that this is not the way that we should be doing business. We got to keep pace with what's going on in the other services. So AFWIC was envisioned, and Clint got the rose pinned on him going forward, and this has matured into a great way of doing business, but it's continuing to mature. What General Miller wanted to ensure, and I am a huge supporter of this, is as we were going forward, we needed to be have the reserve equity baked in early so that we could help determine what is the best way to use the command. That's what you are, that's what we are. We're experts in the way that the Air Force Reserve Command can be used to further the Air Force's agendas. And Clint's got that going on for us, and so with very little more fanfare, Clint, I turn it over to you, my friend.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. Hey, thanks very much for inviting me, General Scobie. And General Scobie and I have known each other for a long time. Most of you have known him a lot longer than I, but boy, you got a great leader, right? You went from one good leader to another, so exciting to work with your team. I've really appreciated working with Cowboy and Turf and the team too, by the way, because everything I'm going to share with you here in the next couple of minutes, we have done together. As we've tried to build this out and make sure that we have the reserve forces, as General Scobie said, baked in from the very beginning. And Cowboy not only has helped me understand how to bake the reserve forces in, but even more importantly, and exactly what we're looking for, is issues completely unrelated to the reserve piece, but the role of AFWIC and the role of deliverer planning in the future. He's given me some good thoughts about how to do that, and that's exactly what we hope for in this partnership. So look, in the next 20-25 minutes, what I'd like to do is I just want to share a very quick version. General Scobie did a great job of teeing that up, but I just want to share with you why is it that the Chief and Secretary personally directed the stand-up of this thing called AFWIC, the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability. And I want to talk to you about some of the key changes all the MAJCOMs and 4 stars have signed up to, and that's really important to note. I know all of you have important relationships with different MAJCOMs and different responsibilities that you have, and it's important that you understand sort of what the MAJCOM role is vis-a-vis the AFWIC now. And then as General Scobie talked about synchronizing, AFWIC is all about synchronizing our future plans and our future capabilities. And if you come away with nothing other than that from my presentation, that's the key takeaway. And then I want to spend just a couple of minutes helping you understand why I think there's an important role for the reserves even near term right now, and maybe the way some of you all or your people can get involved. And more importantly, everybody that works for you will be touched by AFWIC if we do this right at some point in the future. And so I want to make sure you understand all of that too. And by the way, stop me at any time. Anybody has a question at all, stop me. I'll take questions at the end. But if you see something up here that you want to talk about, stop me too. Okay? So next slide. So General Scobie alluded to this a little bit, and hopefully by now you've all read the National Defense Strategy, because this is the key and seminal document of our time. You know, I've been in the strategic planning business for a long time, maybe many of you have as well. This is one of the best written documents I've seen in my 30 years in the Air Force. Not only because of the analysis that went behind it, but it actually gives us a plan to drive forward for the future, right? when the SecDef started building this thing, he gave guidance to his team. He said, this is not, repeat, not going to be one of those documents that we get a pretty glossy cover on and we have a big splashy media release and then we put it up on a shelf or on a coffee table to adorn our offices, right? This is going to be an operational plan for how the Department of Defense moves forward. And the other thing I'll tell you is, again, 30 years in the business, probably the same as a lot of you, I have never seen a chief and secretary roger up to implementing higher guidance than I have with this chief and this secretary on the National Defense Strategy. There is no doubt in anybody's mind on the air staff, this is our strategic plan. And they've made very clear that everything and everybody in the Air Force will align to it or we're not pulling in the right direction. So that's really powerful. The bottom line message, though, of the NDS, and again, I think you all know this, but the world has changed. You know, when I came on active duty in January of '88, many of you, have been around that long in the national defense business. But when I came on active duty, we had one adversary, right? We had the Soviet Union, and they could touch us in one way, nuclear weapons. That was it. Sure, we had some conventional skirmishes around the war, and we were mired in the Cold War environment, right? But one adversary, one threat vector, and we focused all of our time, energy, and effort on that. And as long as we did, we could be, and we were successful. The world has changed now, right? The contested environment across Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Nuclear weapons have proliferated, not just Russia anymore, but China, North Korea, Iran. Think about the strategic threat vectors the cyber environment provides today. And when we talk about strategic attacks, we talk primarily about attacks that can have catastrophic effect on the U.S. or the way we fight, or catastrophic effect on our population or our will to fight. And so that's what we typically refer to nuclear weapons as, the only strategic threat against the U.S. But think about cyber as a strategic threat. What if the adversary took out the entire power grid on the east coast of the United States, from Maine all the way to southern Florida? Would that have a strategic effect on America and our ability to prosecute the war, or fight the war, or our will to fight? Absolutely. What if an adversary could take out the GPS constellation and we had no capability to do precision, navigation, and timing, either in our civilian sector or the military sector all around the world? Would that have a strategic effect? Obviously. So the world has gotten a lot more complex in that we've got this multi-pole, multi-pronged set of threat actors, potential threat actors in the world today, and a myriad of new threat vectors, from nuclear to conventional long-range missiles, right? We've seen the proliferation of conventional long-range missiles in a way that adversaries and potential adversaries can reach out and strike, in some cases, the United States, as some of them are quickly to point out, and in other cases, our regional partners and allies all around the theaters and all around the globe. So the world has gotten far more contested, far more persistent, far more complex, and we've got a lot of other areas that we have to bake in. Couple that with the fact, the rapid pace of technology and change, right? Just think about 10 years ago, we didn't have iPhones. Think about how the iPhone, I'm constantly connected to my bosses, I'm constantly connected to the news, I can order a taxi outside, I can GPS to my favorite fishing hole. I mean, just think about technology and the rapid state of technological change and all the emerging technologies, from hypersonics to directed energy to quantum computing to artificial intelligence to automation and all those things. So how do we harness all that coupled against the backdrop? And oh, by the way, the other thing that makes it such a challenge, the adversaries are figuring this out, right? And they are reorganizing themselves to get after that. China, as you probably know, China as a potential adversary has reorganized into what they call the Chinese Strategic Support Force, where they have taken all their cyber forces and all their space forces and all their EW, electromagnetic warfare forces, and coupled them into a single command called the Strategic Support Force, right? And that's powerful because they've recognized the future relies on our ability to integrate cross-domain operations against all of our capabilities, all of our mission sets, all of our domains to common effect at a single point in space and time to come at us from multiple threat vectors, right? And so the only way we're going to be able to get after that future is if we're prepared for the same. We've already learned through Desert Storm and coming out of Desert Storm the power when you fuse our space capabilities with our air capabilities. As a space and cyber guy, we've seen the power of merging our space and cyber capabilities for common effect. When you bring all those together across the environment, that's what the chief talks about a lot, and we'll talk about later this morning, the future of multi-domain operations in the U.S. And so as we look at all of those things, those are critical requirements for change. The world has changed, technology has changed, the adversary has changed, and if anybody thinks the way that we fought in the 1970s or 80s or even 90s or even 2000s will be exactly the same way we want to fight against the myriad of changes that we've talked about going into the 2025, 2030, 2035 environment, we will be left behind, right? From Clausewitz to Sun Tzu and everybody else that we study, all those dead theorists, right, that we study in our war colleges. Everyone will tell you the biggest mistake you can make is trying to make the next war exactly like the last one that you fought, right? So we've got to get out in front of that, and we've got to be proactive about envisioning the future environment, envisioning the future warfight, and deliberately driving our way forward, not reacting to what the world gives us, but proactively identifying, designing, and driving our way into the future that we want to live in and fight in, not the future that the adversary forces us into. Does that all make sense? So, on page 19 of the NDS, in the third paragraph on the right-hand page in the bottom quadrant, the Secretary of Defense says, given all these changes, technology, environment, threat, warfight, all those things, given all those things, the SecDef said, service secretaries, if you aren't properly organized to get after those threats and changes in the future, if you're not organized to be able to operate, fly, fight, and win in the most highly contested environments against a peer adversary, then take whatever changes you need and make any organizational changes you need to align yourselves and organize yourselves to be able to operate at that high-end environment. Right? Over the last 2 decades or so, most of us in this room have spent our lives fighting or planning or thinking about or supporting the war on terrorism in the Middle East, right? And some of you perhaps have heard our chief get up and say, hi, I'm Dave, and I've got a confession to make, right? He says the first thing you have to do is acknowledge the problem. He says, hi, I'm Dave, and I've spent my whole life fighting terrorism in the Middle East. And I've got to understand that I've got to change. We've got to change. So as we look about how we've spent the last 20 or 30 years of our focus, our attention, and deliberately driving our efforts, we've got to understand, the NDS tells us, what we're supposed to prepare for in the future is for that highly contested, great power competition, peer adversary. And that drives fundamental changes across the Air Force. Next slide. And by the way, as I said, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. So, looking at that paragraph on page 19 and looking against the backdrop of everything else I just described, the Chief and Secretary took stock internally across the Air Force. And they came to some important conclusions, several of which General Scobie already outlined. They came to the conclusion that the way we fought, the way we're organized, and the way we plan for the future is sub-optimized to achieve all those things we need to achieve in the future, right? We're going to have to make some fundamental changes. One of the first things identified is our ability to do enterprise integration or cross-domain integration, right? We talked about China and the way that they've reorganized. We look at other countries around the world who are focused on bringing all their capabilities together for seamless effect to come at us in multi-domains at multiple times and places of their choosing. We look at us moving more and more forward on cross-domain integration. We can't successfully fight against that or successfully prosecute it on our own side unless we can also bring that seamless transition to multi-domain operations to the table. And as the Chief and Secretary looked at our ability, or rather inability, quite frankly, to do multi-domain and cross-domain integration, they said we needed to make some changes. Now, a decade or so ago, we stood up the core function lead, the CIFL process. Because at the time, we were seeking to maximize the portfolio within a specific core function. Air superiority, cyber superiority, agile combat support, right? Global integrated ISR, you're familiar with all those core functions, right? And so if the goal was to maximize our ability to plan, program, provide capabilities, and operate in a single domain, in a single mission set, Well, obviously, the best way to maximize that is put a single MAGCOM, a single 4-star, in charge of everything that goes with that. Put a single 4-star in charge of planning, programming, vision, strategy, future capability development requirements of everything that goes in the ISR portfolio, or everything that goes in the Agile Combat Support portfolio, and you will, by definition, maximize that mission set. Absolutely right, Shaq, and we did that. We did a good job at doing that, maximizing independent, stovepiped mission functions. But as General Scobie alluded to, what we would do then in the planning programming process, and this is self-critical, but that's okay, we have to be self-critical and examine ourselves against the challenge in the future. What we would do then is we would develop 12 independent strategies, visions, requirements, capability development, paths forward, and budgets, and then bring them all together 30 days before the budget was due and try to cram them all together and integrate them all together in rapid fashion with a looming deadline to get it turned into Congress. And we told the Chief and Secretary, look, we've already spent 9 months doing all the hard work building these together, so your ability to affect anything is really just the top 2 or 3% of the dollars that are left over. And if you try to drive us to make any further changes to that, we'll be late to need and miss the budget deadline to OSD and Congress. And so fait accompli, here's the budget. And then, being self-critical, we would sort of stand back and we would say, okay, here's the 12 independent budgets developed by the 12 core functions, and we've strapped them all together. Then we would step back, and again, I'm being self-pejorative here, we would step back and we'd put it up on the screen and we'd say, okay, so what's the story we can tell about the kind of budget we built here? And then we would try to craft a strategic narrative about what the budget was attempting to address. And the Chief and Secretary identified, we got to turn that whole thing upside down. And what we need to do is deliberately plan up front, identify the future Air Force we want to be, the way we want to fight in the future, what our key challenges are, what our key focus areas, what our key priorities are, and then drive the rest of the Air Force to align under that singular set of priorities. So in other words, instead of building the budget and then stepping back and saying, what's the strategic narrative that we want to tell the Congress we're attempting to accomplish, we're going to write the strategic narrative about what we want the budget to accomplish, and then we're going to build a single integrated budget that gets there. So enterprise integration was what they said didn't work properly, that we needed to change for the future. And the second piece was future force design. So enterprise integration and future force design. If you've got 12 different core function leads across 9 different MAGCOMs located all over the globe, and they're each responsible for their own strategic planning, vision, architecture, and design, well, by definition and necessarily, you don't have a single integrated roadmap, design, strategy, or architecture that you're driving to, right? Today, as we speak, we've got 150 some odd roadmaps, flight plans, visions, strategies, architectures, all approved at different levels, from NAV commanders to MAGCOM commanders to 2-letter DCSs to the Chief or Secretary, many with different time horizons. You know, this is the ISR superiority plan for 2020, this is the next gen air dominance plan for 2030, etc., right? And there was no overarching function or single organization that was responsible for bringing all those together in a common roadmap or a common flight plan. We attempted to integrate a couple ways, the strategic master plan and others, but again, that was after each core function had already developed their own independent master plan, and then we tried to stitch them together for a single narrative. Rather, the Chief and Secretary said we need to do deliberate force design up front first with the enterprise priorities of the Air Force, and then let everything else drive. I'll use an example of PNT, precision navigation and timing. At the unclassified level, we all know that we rely almost exclusively on GPS for our PNT. And by the way, I'm a space guy, and I used to command the GPS squadron at Schriever Air Force Base, and you won't find a bigger fan of the GPS constellation than me. But we've put all of our eggs in that single basket, and the adversary's gone to school over the last 30 years about how we use GPS for precision fires, the timing, and everything else. And across all of those adversaries we talk about, they are actively building capability to try to deny us that. So we need to come up with an alternate strategy. There are things like atomic clocks and Turcom navigation and magnetometers and aileron and other things that we can use to bring GPS together. And when you look at the MAGCOM's end-of-year unfunded list, every MAGCOM of the Air Force has improved, resilient, or alternate PNT on their unfunded list. every MAGCOM out there at number 22 or 25 or 28. And when every MAGCOM could fund only their top 7, 8, 9, 12 programs, guess what? Even though you were number 11 on every single MAGCOM's list, that never made the cut. But if you did the parametric analysis and did all the number crunching, it might be that number 11 on everybody's list is actually number 4 as an overall enterprise requirement. And so AFWIC now has the charge of that enterprise integration and future force design, where we look from an enterprise perspective. What are the most important enterprise requirements for the Air Force? And let's fund those and architect those and drive those up front and first, and then drive the rest of the Air Force to follow. So that's what the Chief and Secretary did. They said, we're going to stand up this AFWIC, this Air Force warfighting integration capability, and they're going to be charged with 2 key requirements. Enterprise integration, in other words, bring all those mission sets together so that we integrate them up front. General Scobie talked about baking the reserves, guard reserves in up front, which is the only way to do a mission analysis, right? And we have to do the same thing with our mission integration and our cross-domain integration. And by the way, to that baking it in up front, I also want you to know that when I first was asked to take this job as the AFWIC director, within the first week of me assuming those responsibilities, I went to see the reserves, Cowboy and General Miller, and then the counterparts on the Guard within my first week on the job. Because I said there is no way we can do this mission. There is no way we can architect the future Air Force, which is essentially what AFWIC is charged with doing, unless we have built in up front and early all of the forces and capabilities and all the ways we do business across the Air Force. So that was critical to me. As critical for integrating our reserve forces, as critical it is integrating all of our cross-functional capabilities early into the left of any designer or plane. So those are the responsibilities that the Chief and Secretary gave the AFWIC. Next slide. So this is really what it looks like. If you boil it down, so 2 responsibilities, enterprise integration and future force design. And if you break that sort of into its individual parts, we're really responsible for 4 things. So that was a lot of philosophy, but Clint, what do you actually produce? What are you actually responsible for? What's the output of the AFWIC? Well, we're going to drive 4 key things. First of all, operating concepts. How are we going to fight in the future, right? We can't fight the same way we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s because technology's changed, the adversaries changed, etc., right? I'll give you a good example. Unclassified level, right? For the last 3, 4, 5 decades, the U.S. way of war has been to, as rapidly as possible, robust and put together as large a force as we can, right? Constitute as large a force as we can, deploy them as rapidly as we can into the theater of operations, such that we're just out of the adversary's reach, but within our ability to execute tactical operations at will, right? So we deploy as rapidly as we can with as much force as we can, and we set up in a line where we can touch them, but they can't touch us, and we can operate that way indefinitely until we win, right? That's been the U.S. way of war for the most part. Well, what's changed? What's changed is the adversaries developed conventional cruise missiles, long-range ballistic missiles, hypersonic weapons, other things that can touch us before we can deploy into that range. Or if we deploy into that range, now they can strike us as we're just setting up and beginning to operate. That's a fundamental change, right? Unclassified level, that's a fundamental change. And it requires us to re-look at how we're going to fight in 2030. What are our operational concepts for deployment and employment? What are our operational concepts for where we're going to posture the force, how we're going to position the force, and how we're going to operate the force? That question has to be answered. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck fighting the same way, as I said, we did in the 70s, 80s, and the 25s and 30s, and I think the adversary has the advantage. So the first thing is, how are we going to operate? How are we going to fight as a combined force in the future? Not just an air force, but a combined force. So how are we going to fight? Once we identify how we're going to fight, AFWIC's responsible for building what we call a design blueprint. And essentially what the design blueprint is, it's a summary of the force we need. In other words, if we're no longer going to operate via concepts this way, and we're going to operate as our way of war this way, does that have any changes on the force structure of the Air Force? And the answer is likely, but we need to do all the work to figure that out, right? If we're going to fight differently, that may change the mix of the numbers of fighters we have, or bombers we have, or tankers that we have, or cargo we have. or the organization of our mobility forces if we're going to mobilize our forces differently, or logistics forces if we're going to sustain our forces differently, or long-range standoff versus short-range stand-in or penetrating. And as we look to the future and think about things like artificial intelligence and autonomy and low-cost attritable weapons and or platforms, will that change the force structure of the Air Force? And the answer is all of those likely have an impact. So rather than stumbling into a force structure of the future by independent budgets all coming together and getting stitched, let's do all that analytical work up front to the left and then bring it back to the Chief and Secretary and our 4-stars to make strategic decisions about the kind of Air Force we're going to be, how we're going to fight, and therefore what our force composition needs to be. The future probably requires that we need more of something that either we have already today or don't have, and probably less of something else that we already have or something we need to divest. AFWIC has to figure out what that balance is. So once we've identified how we fight and the force we need, then it's AFWIC's responsibility as the single representative of the operational community back into the R&D, S&T community to make sure we put the right demand signals so that things like artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, directed energy for air-based defense or offensive capability, or whatever those things are, if we've determined that that's how we're going to fight in the future, then AFWIC has to be putting the demand signal on all the S&T R&D folks a decade ahead of time so that we can have all the right technologies to the maturation level we need at the time and place we need them so that we can fulfill the design blueprint the Chief and Secretary have approved. That makes sense? And you've got to put that demand signal on them early because it takes time to develop new capabilities and new weapons and new technologies. And you've got to make sure they're synchronized. So, after we've identified how we're going to fight, the force we need, we've laid in the requirements to the S&T and R&D community, then AFWIC now is responsible for the overarching capability development process or capability development requirements to make sure we're shepherding the Air Force all in the right direction. I'll give you one quick example. After AFWIC stood up and we were told we're responsible for capability development, one of the first things that happened is we had three separate MAGCOMs come forward wanting to start an effort on global secure communications. ACC, Global Strike, and AMC, all three, in a period of about 8 months, came forward and said, hey, we want to start a new global comms capability to improve our ability to have resilient global comms on our platforms, right? What the Air Force really needs is a single architecture for global resilient communication that everybody can tie into everybody and everybody can connect to everybody, not three independent, separate, non-integrated or executing programs. So under the authority of the AFWIC, one of the things we did is we directed, through our capability development guidance, that we merged those three studies into a single study that will provide a single enterprise answer for global secure communications rather than three independent processes and or acquisition plans that would go on separate platforms and not communicate. So that's essentially sort of the four building blocks. So we do the warfighting concepts, we prioritize the capability development, we look at all the new and emerging technologies that are out there, and then we go back and look at, for instance, hypersonics. Hypersonics is an emerging technology, and we're doing tests and demos of hypersonics right now today. But what's our operational concept of employment for hypersonic weapons across the enterprise? Global Strike Command is doing some good work figuring out how to use it off a bomber, but is that the only thing I want to do, and is that the optimal thing? Or do we need to look more broadly at what our enterprise concept is for the optimal use of a hypersonic weapon across capabilities, from bombers to fighters and other things that you can imagine? And when you put all that together, you come up with an integrated force design driving our multi-domain force of the future. Next slide. So what does this look like? Very briefly, and then I'm going to wrap up. Very briefly, this is the AFWIC organization. We stood up, we declared IOC on 1 April of this year with 44 people. And we got after it and started laying in as many plans as we could. And by the way, of those initial 44 people we got started with, about 8 or 10 of them were guardsmen or reservists. That was critical to getting us up and running. Critical. And that's one of the power of our reserve forces, by the way, is you can surge and you can augment and fill important needs where they were. I wouldn't have been able to get up and running and declare IOC without the support I got from the Guard Reserves. In that timeline, we were given about 100 days to get IOC. So, 40 people IOC. Now we're driving to IOC Plus. And there's a memo on the desk of the vice under right now, getting ready to direct a set of billet moves from across the MAJCOMs and the air staff that will grow this organization to 261 billets. That's a good-sized organization, but I described a good-sized amount of work that we've got to do in architecting the future Air Force, right? So very briefly, let me talk about the FID, the Functional Integration Division. We talked about how if you have 12 core functions, stovepipe, live and work in different places, never come together on a periodic enough basis to really integrate things, how would you do that differently? Well, what we've done in the Functional Integration Division, we've brought all 12 core functions of the Air Force together. We put an 06 in charge of each one of those mission sets, and we're going to have 6 to 8 to 10 SME experts in each of those core functions. This is going to be an organization of about 110 people, and they're going to live and work and write and struggle and execute together every single day to develop, build cross-domain concepts, cross-domain capabilities, cross-functional future force designs. So that's how we're getting after the future force integration piece. And then over here, we've developed all the right organizations to do the kind of things you think of that happen in the Pentagon, like planning and programming and future concept development and programming guidance and some of those sorts of things. So that's the basic laydown of the AFWIC. Now, next slide. Here's what's really important for you all. What's really important for you all is I stood up very early this Air Force Integration Cell. Colonel Tim Welter, who's standing there in the back, is our lead. And General Miller and Cowboy, thank you for giving us Tim. He's been extraordinary. Lieutenant Colonel Sean Hoyer is standing back there too. Sean was one of our initial plank holders, right? One of those 44 people that I couldn't have stood IOC up without him, that the reserves contributed early. So I've already got key leadership inside the AFWIC at the 06 level, and we've got a plan already approved by your leadership to grow us to 10 full-time billets inside the AFWIC. Some will be SME experts from over here, right? And that's another way that the reserves are really postured to help us. Because I need people who have been doing global mobility for the last 10 years of their life, or doing air superiority the last 10 years of their life, or doing combat deployments the last 10 years of their life. Because inside the FID, the Functional Integration Division, is where all those SME experts live that are going to help us identify new concepts and new warfighting capabilities and new constructs and flesh all that out into future force designs, right? And so you all are uniquely suited to provide people with vast experience in those operational areas. To come to DC on a 2 or 3 year tour and be part of the FID and help us drive the architecture of the future Air Force. So the pitch I make to all of you is if you have bright young captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, or colonels, or even civilians at the GS 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 range, and you want them to get some professional experience to come to DC, they can be part of, at the ground level, of driving the future force design of the Air Force. And that's pretty powerful. So that's the pitch I'll make to all of you. We've also identified that we think we could ingest a general officer from the reserves into the AFWIC in a senior leadership position, either as an AFWIC deputy or a senior division chief, and we're working through that now. But we've had great feedback from the reserves that you all believe there's value. I just need to get up to IOC Plus. I need to get the organization stabilized, and then we'll continue those discussions. But for all of you here in this room, I may, depending on General Scobie and General Rydon, have an opportunity for a one-star to join the AFWIC here in the near future too. And I think that would really be a bonus. So many important things that the reserves provide us in terms of surge support, augmented support, and being able to provide expertise. So if you've got somebody, like I said, who's been doing the operational mission for the last 10, 15 years, and they want to come be a SME and helping us design that, that'd be powerful. Over here on this side of the house, if you've got bright and shinies that want to come learn about how we do capability development, planning, programming, process design, right, as a professional growth experience on a 2 to 3 year tour, then we've got a place for them in that part of the organization too. So anyway, that's the bottom line on what we're trying to do. Enterprise integration, future force design, across those 4 key areas. How we're going to fight, what kind of force we need, what are the R&D, S&T needs, and then what are the capability development efforts that we prioritize across the MAJCOMs. One other thing, can you go back one slide? Here's a really important point that I want to mention too. Everything I've talked about, you will probably realize, in some way alters and according to some usurps the authority of what was the MAJCOM commander and the civil lead previously, right? The core function lead used to be able to do their own planning, programming, requirements, strategy, right? And now I'm describing that all of that, or much of that, is now centralized in the AFWIC, right? That's a big way of doing business. Here's the important message for you. 3 Coronas ago, I got up in front of the chief and the secretary, all the 4-star MAJCOM commanders, General Miller and General Rice in the Guard, and I laid this whole thing out. And then the chief, I was asked to leave, and the chief and vice and the secretary led a discussion that culminated with, okay, everybody, are we all in agreement on the need that we have to change for the future? And the table slap was yes. Are we all in agreement that we're going to pitch in and do this together? And the table slap was yes. Are we all in agreement that we're going to change some fundamental roles and responsibilities that previously were vested in the core function leads and the MAJCOM commanders and transition into a more centralized role, largely under the AFWIC? And the table slap from every 4-star in the Air Force was yes, it's for the good of the Air Force and we're going to make it work. And that was a powerful foundation and platform to be able to move us forward. So that's where we stand today. We're going to declare IOC Plus here in the next couple of months. We're driving to 261 billets. I've already got a plan to ingest 10 reservists into that full-time force, another 12, 14, or 16 IMAs, with more growth opportunity in the future, depending on how we identify our roles and responsibilities. And I can't do it without your support, General Scobie and team. And I don't want to, because it wouldn't be the right thing for the Air Force. So, any questions for me? I'll just wrap up. Cowboy.
So the NDS drives a lot of this, so I can see OSD buying these concepts. How are we socializing with the Congress? If you listen to the Secretary's briefing from yesterday and you do the math, you're talking about an additional 100,000 plus airmen to get to where we need to be. How